Hello and welcome back to Read Becca. We are here finally, after much delay, for my favorite fiction reads of 2022. These are not all published in 2022. They're not in any particular order. These are just the books I really loved. And that was very hard to narrow down because as you saw with my nonfiction list, which I've already posted, I'll link it down below, it was hard to narrow things down, and I read so much this year that was great. So I wanted to kind of be brutal and really narrow this list down, but I still had quite a few reads. Now, in total, I read or DNF'd 173 books last year in 2022. So there was a lot to sift through to pick out these favorites. I enjoyed so many of those. Over half of those books I really enjoyed. So yes, I have narrowed it down very, very much. So let's start with the books that I didn't quite push onto the favorites list. October in particular was a phenomenal reading month for me. I had 3 books specifically picked out for my TBR that all 3 ended up being really fantastic reads. So let's talk about the 2 that didn't make it and then the one that did. So the 2 that didn't quite make my favorites of the year, but were very close, were Woman Eating by Claire Coda and A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. So A Certain Hunger is a novel told from the perspective of this sort of older woman foodie who is a food writer and critic. And that comes through in the writing very strongly. It has that sense of food writing all throughout. Except she is a literal man-eater. She's a cannibal, so she has been secretly killing and eating men. So we're getting this lovely story of food writing and food criticism from her perspective as this powerful woman in that world. But we're also getting kind of a creepy story of a first-person perspective of someone who is probably a sociopath. And it's really fun to read. It's really beautifully written, if you can handle a little light cannibalism. Woman Eating, on the other hand, is a vampire novel, a literary vampire novel, as the tagline says. And it's really much more about the mundane than any sort of vampire elements that you would think of. There's, it's interwoven into the story significantly, but the story is about this young woman who's finding her way as a new adult for the first time. And that does involve things like, how do I source blood? So she's trying to find her own way separate from her mother is an artist who is coming into the art world on her own for the first time. And she's dealing with a vampire mother who really protected her and sheltered her in life, who now has Alzheimer's somehow. And she's having to settle that situation with a vampire who has lived a long time. And fortunately, everyone kind of assumes that things she's saying about that are the dementia. So it has a lot of those elements of coming of age, and I would say millennial fiction for sure is a part of it. And I just enjoyed the themes that were explored there so much. So those 2 were honorable mentions. They didn't quite edge over as well as this 3rd one. The 3rd one was phenomenal for me. Like, everything was pretty much on point in the writing of this, the storytelling, the characterization. And all 3 of these are kind of mundane despite their unnatural elements. And this 3rd one that is my first favorite for the list is Briefly A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. Now, I've not read from Nell Stevens before, but she seems to have a lean for the historical. And she wrote about Bleak House, or Bleaker House, I think is the title of her book, as a nonfiction work. And this one is very grounded in historical fiction, except that our primary character is a ghost. So we are following this young girl who died sometime in the late 15th century. She died giving birth, though, at 14 years old in a hilltop monastery in Majorca. Now, she's kind of been kicking around this monastery in the local area, as you do after you've died, and hundreds of years have passed, a couple hundred years. And then we have the French author, George Sand, she shows up with her lover and the composer of Francois Chopin and her two children, and they decide they're going to have a winter vacation at this hilltop monastery. And this young ghost girl becomes completely enamored with George Sand as this woman who doesn't fit standards of the time or gender roles. She wears pants, which is very shocking. And we're seeing their relationship, George Sand and Francois Chopin, the difficulties that he's having. He's got consumption, and so they've come there in hopes that they will help his health, even though we really get into the fact that it's quite cold and damp. They're in these stone walls that they had expected the seaside to be sunny and warm, and they're not experiencing that. So it is this long drawn out sort of mild misery. The children don't really want to be there. The villagers don't like them, and they don't speak the same language. So they're really annoyed about how improper they all are. The fact that she's there with a lover is horrifying to the villagers. So it's those mundane conflicts that are present in that story that are all being observed by this young girl. We do also then go back and see George Sand's history. We see the ghost girl's history as well. How did she come to die at this monastery? How did she come to be pregnant? We see this, what she thought of as a kind of a sweeping love story for herself. And we get caught up in the emotions. So this is a story of sapphic yearning for this girl. It's a female desire, and it's all about the constraints of the feminine at these times when these two women lived. And I just really love the exploration that this book had of those themes. The second book for my favorites was kind of unexpected. This was the only book that I picked from my BookTube prize reading as well, and I think it was out very early. It was unexpected because I hated this book at first. When I started The Republic of False Truths by Ala Al-Aswani and translated by S.R. Fellows, I was not into it. I was really bothered how evil all of the characters were. They were just one note, very bad all the time. And as we got into it, though, it became more layered and nuanced in showing us what's going on. The characters at first were all very much like mustache twirlingly bad. We're in this high-powered general's perspective to start, and I think there's literal torture on the page, so there is quite a bit of graphic violence in here, and even sexual assaults, so beware going in there. There is that element. But I think this did such a great job of telling us the story of the Egyptian Revolution and Tahrir Square massacre, the protests and why students were revolting, and really giving us all of the sides to this, because we get multiple levels of politics, of media, of students, as I said. We get the viewpoints of those who have received so much propaganda and misinformation for us to understand exactly why, these students felt the way they did and were rising up against corruption at every level, while their own family members were completely against them because of the misinformation that they had heard about what these students were doing, and that they were some sort of shadowy group doing something evil. And so we see that play out through a very vast cast of characters. So we are really getting this strata of perspectives. And I just think it was so well executed to tell me this story that I knew basically nothing about before this book. Being in the Western world, I'm so underexposed to what's going on elsewhere in the world, and I think this really sparked an interest in finding out more and reading more on that topic. So it really turned me around. It does have a bit of a satirical feel to it, in very much going over the top at times, and as I said with the beginning, the kind of mustache twirlingly evil people, but I think it's so well done in being a cutting satire of what's happening in the corruption at every level of their politics, of the society, and the way even in family power structures it reinforces the corrupt aspects. So I found this a really powerful read. for my next favorite, we have kind of a 2-for-1 because I picked The Beauty by Elia Whiteley, and this also contains Peace Pipe. And they're two sort of novellas together. It's a very, very tiny double publication, and I couldn't pick one of the two to select, so I'm just picking them both. The Beauty is a wonderful fungal horror, and it's a feminist take on this story where a dystopia has occurred, something's happened, and all the women are dying out until one day this storyteller goes out into the woods and sees these spores growing up in the ground, the mushrooms, in the form of women, where the women had died. And so what happens from there is a story about how men conceptualize women and what it means when you see women for their use. There's so much commentary in this, I think, that really is what makes it wonderful. But the writing is gorgeous as well. And then the second story, Peace Pipe, is the story of linguistics. It's a linguistic sci-fi tale that's told almost entirely from one room, where this linguist who works on first contact usually is in this room and realizes the gurgling of the pipe in the room is actually language. And so this individual starts learning the language of the pipe and begins communicating. And so we see that all play out in this single little short story. And it's wonderful. It's very linguistic, anthropological sci-fi, which is my absolute catnip. And so this basically affirmed Elia Whiteley as a new favorite author to dive into. So I will be reading probably everything that Whiteley has written. The next one is another kind of experimentally sci-fi, and that's The Employees by Olga Ravn and translated by Martin Aiken. This is told entirely through statements from these employees working as the crew of a ship who have brought objects from an alien planet onto their ship. And it's really interesting. It's told non-linearly, so the statements are spread out, in a random order somewhat. And I haven't tried reading them in numbered order because they do each have a number, but I don't think it would be any more significantly comprehensible. It's something you have to draw the meaning out of a little bit yourself. For me, this is a little bit like a combination between Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer and To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. Not in that it's like cozy or chill, but in that is about the wonder of discovery, and Annihilation is as well. And there's an element of that. There's also quite a bit of commentary on corporatism here, because they are employed by this company that is a non-presence in these interviews. So we're only getting one side of these statements as they're grappling with understanding the sensory interaction with these objects. The corporation doesn't really seem to care for their humanness. There are humans and humanoids here, and there's a very strong difference between the two. And the sensory elements, the social needs, are often, sort of disregarded by the decisions the corporation makes about what they do. And so, I can't really talk about this one very much, but I just loved it. I love the surreal elements to it. I love the imagery and the full sensory aspect to it. So great new author that I hope to get into more. Staying with sci-fi a bit, my next pick was Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez, and I've already got a full review up for this one. I really didn't know what to expect going into this. So many people gush about this, but don't really tell you what it's about too much, and I can understand why, because this is told in a tapestry of perspectives. We change perspectives every chapter, and we almost never go back to the same perspectives. But those perspective changes are so purposeful. They really show us a unique view of things, and every single time it feels like a fully formed character. So the story here is kind of this story of a ship's crew who have taken on an injured boy who's not speaking, and it has a strong tie to music. He has this flute that he does play even though he doesn't speak, and they're taking him on a journey from one planet where he crash landed to a space station where they're going to figure out what to do with him, or offload him more or less, because they don't have any ties to this boy. And that sets off this long-term journey of years that he becomes directly connected to the captain's life, and the captain and crew, as they go on this lengthy journey, begin kind of a found family situation, because they're stuck together for a really long time, kicking around through these fringe planets where people are there to escape corporate controls, and so mostly made up of artists and musicians and creatives who don't want to be culturally oppressed. So because of that means we do have this more standard area through this universe where we have a corporate controlled situation, corporations managing the ways people live, because everybody has fled Earth due to climate disaster, and they have to sort of control things to make sure that society stays managed based on the fact that people are traveling very long distances of years between planets, or from a planet to a space station to transport goods. And so they can't show up and not be able to speak the language. So there are all these cultural controls that make sense but are still oppressive. And so this is doing so many amazing things from an ideas perspective. Everything I touched on is such a minor, like barely touches the tip of what this is doing in terms of its telling, its prose, the themes that it's exploring. As it goes on, it explores more and more themes. And I just loved the way that this wrapped up and where it was going with all of that had been happening early in the novel. So yeah, I've already got a full review for this, so I will link that down below as well. The next book that I have on my favorites is both the first book I finished in 2022 and the only thriller to actually make it onto my favorites list. I do read a fair amount of thrillers, but this was the only one to edge into my favorites, and it was a great start to the year. It was The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. So this one really surprised me with how much I liked it. I had incorrectly thought it was just straight up historical fiction, and was so wrong. It's a thriller and is very, very eerie, spooky sort of thriller. There's actual non-real stuff happening here, so maybe thriller into mild horror. But it's a split timeline story. It's very compulsively readable. We're following this young woman who has taken a break from college and is sort of reliving her aunt's life after, in the past, her aunt disappeared around her same age while working at this motel. And so as this girl is reliving her aunt's life, it incorporates a lot of true crime type elements, and her roommate is very obsessed with true crime podcasts. So there's no actual podcast elements to this, but it really incorporates those vibes that are very much trending right now in thrillers. And I just loved seeing that all play out. I loved the non-real elements. The paranormal was actually really creepy and spooky without being too gruesome. I mean, this definitely has some gruesome aspects, but it really does go there and pushes into the unreal. So this hotel, very obviously, I don't need to really tell you it's haunted. So she almost immediately starts having weird happenings when she's at the hotel working nights. And that just has this immense sense of atmosphere. The flipping back and forth between the timelines is done so well. And what is for me, or what was for me, the most key element here is that the author doesn't obscure things in order to make the thrills happen. She actually gives us the information right away. Like, she keeps showing us exactly what is going to happen in the past storyline. She'll just show us, and then more of it plays out in the present timeline, and it just blows you away anyway. And so she's not doing switcheroos or pulling the wool out of the front of your eyes so much as she is just giving us a really layered story, and she tells it so well. So I think it's extremely well written thriller. The other book that's sort of another paranormally horror spooky book is Things in Jars by Jess Kid. This one really surprised me because I did set out this year with a bunch of books I wanted to get to that were modern ladies writing sort of gothic fiction. And this is that, but it does actually push truly into the unreal and paranormal, unlike a lot of Gothic. So a lot of Gothic leaves the question open-ended of, was there something actually paranormal there? Here there's definitely non-real stuff, multiple non-real things. And this establishes that atmosphere so well of Victorian London and gives us things that were horrifying of the time in reality. The operating surgery theaters that were truly gruesome, and carnivals of oddities treating strange people badly. And I think this was a good depiction of that as far as I'm aware. I know Jen Campbell has said that, Just Kid is someone that she sort of supports in that handling. So I think that was good overall. But this is also a dual timeline, much like the previous book. So we are following one character's perspective, though, at 2 points in her life. And she's a woman who is very take charge for herself. She's a woman who is very in charge of her own life. She, oddly, for a woman of this time, is sort of a private investigator type. She knows about forensics, and she is starting to investigate this case that she's been given of a girl who has been kidnapped, and for some reason her family has kept her a secret her whole life, so they don't want to go to the police about this. So we're uncovering that aspect, but then at the same time in the past timeline, we're seeing her childhood as a young girl. How did she come to have this skill set of understanding forensics and these investigative skills? And she was sold as a child to this man who sort of trained her in these skills, and his family. And so we see the dynamics between the family, and that all comes together with this story as it plays out. So this had such lush prose, very great atmosphere. That's obviously what you're going for in a Gothic novel, is establishing really rich atmosphere, and this does that so well. The characterization is great, and even though it is dark, it's still humorous, and has a certain levity to it. So early on, our character establishes a friendship with a ghost, and they have great banter together. So the characterization, the liveliness of this novel, and the atmosphere it establishes are just all around fabulous. So loved this one. Then heading in the direction of more fantasy-ish, we have Palimpsest by Catherine M. Valenti. Valenti is one of my favorite authors, and I think this is a new favorite of her work. I did read multiple works from her this year, and this one was the real standout. So this one is really hard to explain because it's very weird and very surreal. It is following many characters in this setting, the real world setting, all key cities of the world, all around the world. So we are following these characters as many of them have sex and see a map form on their body. And after that happens, it's almost like a magical STD. This is the gateway to go to this magical world. And so once someone has been there, they're always chasing, trying to get back. And people who have been there are gateways now through sex to get someone else there. And so we see all of these characters as, eventually some of them come into contact with one another as a result of this connection that they have to this world they're ever seeking to get to. And it's such a weird world. My best comparison to give you for what this world is like is it's like Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away, where it's very whimsical and strange and definitely unreal. There is a moment where they're going into a tea house, and it talks about them having to get down and almost slide on their bellies to go in the door because only their heads and shoulders will fit. And it's very strange, but it's also so beautiful and magical. And the things these people go through are really emotional, and the dynamics of the relationships that they have. This also definitely has a lot of LGBTQ plus elements because a lot of the sex is casual, but in many cases they are forming relationships, but not based on gender or sexuality, because they simply need to have sex with someone who has actually been to this place. So there's a lot of themes explored there. People have very strong feelings about Valenti's prose, but for me, the lyrical aspect of the prose here, even though, you know, her writing voice is very strong. If you don't get along with the prose right off, you're probably not going to like her books. But here it's such a vehicle for the story that it's so effective. And I think that's why this is my new favorite, because there are other books where, you know, the prose is equally as strong and I enjoy it, but it's not doing anything for the story specifically. This one, it feels like it's integral to the telling of this story. So again, this is a new favorite from Valenti for me, so I'm just so pleased to have finally gotten to this one. Next, we have one that's sort of a mix between sci-fi and fantasy, and that is Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And this is just a novella. It's really phenomenal in the telling because it's alternating between two perspectives. And from one perspective, we are following this woman in, it feels like a fantasy world, who is beset by some magical problems. And so she goes looking for this elder who seems to have powers beyond what anyone else does, and she thinks he's going to be able to help them. And so she goes and climbs his tower basically and wakes him up, and he agrees to go along and help her. And once we're in his perspective, we see that he's an anthropologist. He is there observing this planet that he's on, and he's from a much more technologically advanced planet. And so he has a completely different lens, and everything that they're going through, the two of them, we see the differences in perspective on what for him is all technology versus for her it's just magic. So this is really playing with that aspect of, you know, any sufficiently advanced technology is indecipherable from magic. And it's such a good execution of that. It's also a really phenomenal execution of linguistics and communication difficulties across these differences. I can't really get into depth on this one because it is so short, and so much is about the reveals of seeing the same scene play out each time from the two perspectives, and how different their perception of the world is incredible. It's just a stunning accomplishment of storytelling from Tchaikovsky. So this one I think just came out in 2021, so it was a fairly new release, and I did actually follow with the release of his novella Ogres, which is kind of similar in that it's got this mixture of fantasy and science fiction, and it's a lot about perception. So I think the two were both very good, but this one was by far much more stunning in its execution and themes and the way it was delivered. Then we actually have a whole series. It was the Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett, but Shorefall, the second book, was my favorite. Very unusual that the second book did not have a mid-trilogy slump at all. I loved this series start to finish. It's doing such inventive things. It's kind of like a mix between Mistborn and Lies of Locke Lamora. It's in a pseudo-Italian setting with a hard magic, high fantasy setup. And we're following multiple characters that form essentially a heist crew at the beginning. And they don't all agree with each other, but they kind of have to work together in order to reach their goals. And I think that's a major theme throughout this story, that we have such great dynamics between characters, and they often have to work together with those they're antagonistic to, which you don't see very often in these sort of books. And so I just absolutely adored this. It's got such great exploration of capitalistic systems and corporatism, because we are in this world that's set up based on its magic to have these powerful guilds, and anyone who is not part of the guild doesn't have power. And so moving from a small city-centered setup in book one, it expands out into something much more grand and a lot more about Well, in book one, very much the goals are about overturning the system that has been oppressing everyone for so long and resulting in literal slavery. And as we progress through it, goes beyond their city and wanting to change the way the world works. And in many cases, this is also an industrial revolution story, because the founders of the title are these almost godlike ancient figures who no longer exist, but they could do things with magic beyond the imagination of the people at the time the story's happening. And so they're going through magical innovations and invention over the course of the story in the trilogy, that they are gaining so much power and creating things that they never could have imagined before themselves. So we see that exponential growth over the course of the trilogy that is just mind-boggling. So I think this is a beautifully executed trilogy. It's a little dark and grim at points, very graphic violence in this particular second novel, I would say. And it has such heart and sense of connection between the characters, though, that really ties it together. So it's a great one. I read this all back to back to back and enjoyed every moment of it. Then I think we are down to the cozy fantasy dive that I went into at the end of the year. So I really did enjoy digging into some cozy fantasy in 2022. I think that is the new emerging subgenre of fantasy right now that's really blowing up. And unsurprisingly, I just went along for the ride and discovered as much as I could. So the first one is along those lines, but I was rereading the Tea Dragon Society books. These are children's books, comics, and they, I think at least the first is available to read online, or was, as a webcomic, and then it got turned into this lovely Oni Press editions, and they are just so beautifully illustrated. This is written and illustrated by Kay O'Neill, and I adore the artwork. So you're there for the beautiful, lush, colorful art, but it's also extremely cozy. So this third book is my favorite of the series. The first two are very simplistic and they feel a little like for children. The third one is really bringing together a lot of the elements of the storytelling from the first two. Multiple characters from the first two are, kind of brought back and pulled together. And this has a lot more depth to it than the first two stories. So that's why it is on this favorites list over my rereads of the first two. It was my first time reading this one as well. And this is such a beautiful story of community and family, or found family, of finding love, of being true to yourself. So the kind of spark of the first story is that this is a community where tea dragons exist, and a little girl finds a tea dragon and doesn't know how to take care of it, and so she goes to the tea shop and they offer to give her lessons there at the tea shop on how to care for a tea dragon, because it's this sort of dying specialty of knowing how to care for them, that nobody is keeping up understanding how to do that. So it's kind of all about ancestral knowledge sharing across this series, and it's just so heartwarming. That's the number one thing about this series is heartwarming. The next one that's not going to surprise anyone at all is the most popular cozy fantasy this past year, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Now, this is the self-published copy that I don't think I've seen anybody showing the back, so I don't know if this was on the tour copy. It does wrap around the cover, but Thimble, our lovely little rat baker here, is actually on the cover. But everybody seems to love Thimble, and he's got a little apron on. You can barely see tied on his back, and he's holding like a pastry. But I just love that. This is a cozy story about running a coffee shop in a high fantasy world. There's no epic stakes. There's some drama. There's like organized crime in this city, and that's one of the things that has to be dealt with. But mainly this is about Viv, our orc here on the cover, wanting to hang up her sword, quit the questing life, and open a coffee shop because she's heard about it in the gnomish cities. And so she wants to set out and do this where no one knows what coffee even is. And so she has to educate people and figure out how to market. She goes through literally physically building a coffee shop somewhere nobody knows what that really requires, and hiring a builder, hiring someone to help her figure out how to run the business. The succubus, there is a minor sapphic relationship here with these two. It's nothing major on the page, but it's a sweet romance in the background to the story. So there are so many cozy, wonderful elements to this story that just were the right thing at the right time for me, and I think so many other people. So this definitely had to be on my favorites list because I think this very much set off my journey into deep diving the cozy fantasy genre. Then we have kind of a Regency fantasy cozy, and that is Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quenvy Olson. And this is very much a proper Regency story. We're following Miss Percy, who's a 40-year-old spinster who's spent her life caring for other people. She's a governess to her sister's children and has kind of decided that adventures and anything that she might want is not really in the cards for her. And then she gets an inheritance, a sort of strange inheritance, and she tries to keep secret what she was given. Everyone seems to assume it's money, and her family even want to take it from her. She's sort of beset by people not wanting her to have this inheritance. And it's really just papers and some strange rocks. So she seeks the help of the vicar, who's kind of the local source of knowledge, and they start looking into this together and trying to figure out what the heck this inheritance means. And then one day, the rock hatches, and it is our tiny dragon here. So Miss Percy and the vicar are trapped and trying to hide out with this dragon and make sure it's kept a secret while she's still serving her governess duties and trying to keep the kids out of the dragon. It's adorable and sweet. And then a stranger shows up who knows that it's a dragon, but obviously can't tell anyone, and thinks it should belong to him. So then that's where the threat comes into this. There are moments of a kind of real threat to this in that aspect, but it still stays very cozy and it's well balanced, I think. So I would put this in the cozy genre. But mostly this is just her learning about how to take care of a dragon. To the title, she is the person who decides to start writing this guide because she realized, hey, we need to know how to take care of it, and we're trying to figure that out, so maybe we should record it. So at the chapter headers and whatnot, you're getting quotes from her eventual guide that we see her start during this book. So it's a really wonderful story I love that aspect of it having kind of a book within a book, or a connection with the book within a book. I love the characterization of Miss Percy. There was a very minor, again, background, proper Regency romance that's made up of sort of sly glances with the vicar. Yeah, so it's very, very sweet and lovely, and I just enjoyed every minute of it. And hopefully, finally, and I've not forgotten any books, my last book on the list is Sacred Cat Island by Harmon Cooper. And interestingly, this is, if you get it on audio, narrated by Travis Baldry, who is, on top of being now an author, previously he was a professional audiobook narrator. So he does do a lot of self-published fantasy. And this one is very cozy, very whimsical, and very much inspired by Stardew Valley. So if you were familiar with, I think Stardew Valley, I've never played Animal Crossing, but as far as I understand, it's very, very similar. So it has those cozy community vibes, similar to Legends and Lattes. That's the major aspect of this. We're following two boys as they and their father are moving to this island to take over running the general store after their uncle has passed away, who used to run the store. This island is mostly retirees, and some of them are curmudgeonly, some of them are very delightful and love these kids being around, but their village has kind of become run down, and tourists don't come from off the island anymore, and things are not working the way they used to. So these boys, along with their dad, start to have a lot of ideas for revitalizing the community on the island. So most of this book is them going and meeting, getting to know the members of the community, coming up with these ideas and pitching them to the community, and sort of slowly implementing fixes to the community. This is, however, a lit RPG, which means there are some actual text on the page that lays out things to do with a role-playing game. You don't really need to read that for this book. It's not really required. I personally liked it because we see things like stats go up. I love seeing our character's empathy stat go up as he gets to know other members of the community, people who are maybe disabled or have a mental illness, and he's learning to understand different people. We also get to see them getting to know the cats on the island. This obviously being Sacred Cat Island, there are cats everywhere, and they meet all of the cats on the island, and they're all over the place. And so we do see sort of names and stats for all the cats. We also see quest text. So it being a role-playing game, they get quests. Their dad gives them chores and they come up as dad quests. It's very delightful. Them getting to know all these members of the community is just the wonderful part of this. There's also whimsical magic to the island. Things like a daily prize that floats around hooked to a balloon and nobody knows where it comes from. And several of them are, trying to catch it because it's this wonderful thing. It's often not super valuable things, but useful things or whimsical things. There is certain magic to the island that is kind of a bigger element, and that's a major part of the story, is these two boys getting to know the community and uncovering the magic of the island. This is just a wonderful one to wrap up this video on because pretty much everything about this was very mundane and whimsical and no real drama. There's a small amount of drama at the end, but it's in service of showing everything these boys have really gained over the course of this novel and learning empathy and getting to know their community. So yeah, a great one to stop the video on. That's my favorites of 2022. I am guessing, and hopefully some of these are maybe new to you if you haven't seen them before. Several of these were self-published books that I really loved. I know Miss Percy, I already have the sequel and I'm looking forward to getting to it. So this was such a great selection of books and such a great reading year for me overall in 2022. So let me know down below if you are going to be picking any of these up, or let me know what your favorite book of 2022 was. And as always, thanks so much for watching.